Dante Alighieri died in 1321, exiled from the city he loved most. He never returned to Florence, and Florence never deserved him back. Yet 7 centuries later, his ideas remain structurally embedded in Western civilization, not as decorations on library shelves, but as load-bearing walls in how we think. His fingerprints are on the separation of church and state. They are on the very language of Italy itself. They are on our modern assumptions about free will, justice, and human purpose. They are on the way we conceive the relationship between knowledge and happiness. Most people know Dante only through the Inferno, the first third of his Divine Comedy. They know the 9 circles of hell, the punishments, the famous line about abandoning hope. This is like knowing Einstein only for the equation and nothing about relativity itself. The Inferno was a starting point, not the destination. Dante built an entire system of thought across multiple works over decades. The Divine Comedy is the crown, but the Convivio, De Monarchia, Vita Nuova, and De Vulgari Eloquentia are its foundations. Together, these works form one of the most unified intellectual projects in history. Each text feeds into the others like organs in a single body. Dante was a poet, yes, but calling him only a poet misses the architecture. He was a moral philosopher who happened to write in verse. He was a political theorist who argued for world government 3 centuries before Hobbes. He was a psychologist of the soul who mapped cognition and emotion with startling precision. He was a linguist who wrote the first serious defense of writing philosophy in everyday language. And he was a cosmologist who conceived the shape of the universe in a way that anticipated modern topology. What makes Dante genuinely unusual is not any single idea, but the total integration. He did not treat politics, ethics, theology, psychology, and cosmology as separate fields. He treated them as one field, because he believed reality itself was one unified structure. The way the planets move, the way the soul operates, the way governments should function. For Dante, these followed the same underlying logic. Get one wrong, and you necessarily get the others wrong too. This is the full map of that logic, not a summary, but a reconstruction of the thinking itself. Part 1. The Forge that Made the Mind. Dante Alighieri was born in Florence in 1265 to a family of minor nobility. His mother died when he was young, and his father remarried and died before Dante reached adulthood. These early losses matter because they shaped a mind that would become obsessed with stability. Political stability, cosmic stability, moral stability, the stability of the soul itself. Florence, in the late 13th century, was one of the wealthiest cities in Europe. It was also one of the most politically violent. The city was torn between 2 factions called the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. The Guelphs supported the Pope's political authority. The Ghibellines supported the emperors. Even after the Ghibellines were largely defeated, the Guelphs split into black and white factions. Dante belonged to the white Guelphs, who wanted to limit papal interference in Florentine affairs. In 1302, when the black Guelphs seized power with papal backing, Dante was exiled. He was sentenced to death by burning if he ever returned. This exile lasted the remaining 19 years of his life. He wandered between Italian courts, dependent on the patronage of noble families. The bitterness of this displacement saturates every major work he produced afterward. But exile also gave Dante something essential: intellectual freedom from factional loyalty. He later wrote that he had become a party of one. That independence is what allowed him to build a philosophical system rather than a political platform. Now, the intellectual raw material. Dante did not invent his philosophy from nothing. He synthesized it from three distinct and sometimes conflicting traditions. The first was Aristotle, whom medieval scholars called simply the philosopher. Dante absorbed Aristotle's logic, his natural philosophy, his ethics, and his political theory. From Aristotle he took the foundational idea that everything in nature has a purpose. An acorn exists to become an oak. A human being exists to actualize the full capacity of the intellect. This concept, called teleology, meaning purpose-driven design, became the spine of Dante's entire system. Every argument he made about politics, morality, and the soul rests on this Aristotelian backbone. The second tradition was Christian theology, primarily filtered through Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas had spent his career reconciling Aristotle with Catholic doctrine. He argued that reason and faith were not enemies but complementary paths to truth. Reason could take you far, but only divine revelation could take you all the way to God. Dante adopted this framework, but modified it in a critical way. He gave reason more autonomy than Aquinas did, and he gave the secular world its own independent dignity. For Aquinas, earthly happiness was always subordinate to heavenly happiness. For Dante, earthly happiness had a genuine value of its own, pursued through philosophy and good government. The third tradition was Neoplatonism, which reached Dante through several channels. One was the Liber de Causis, a 9th century text wrongly attributed to Aristotle. Another was the work of 12th century poet-philosophers like Bernardus Silvestris and Alan of Lille. From this tradition, Dante absorbed the idea that the universe is a cascading hierarchy of being. God emanates power downward through the angelic intelligences, through the celestial spheres, into matter. Everything that exists participates in divine goodness to the degree its nature allows. This gave Dante a vertical architecture for reality that his Aristotelian training alone could not provide. Aristotle explained how things worked. Neoplatonism told Dante why they were arranged as they were. There was also a fourth and more controversial influence. The radical Aristotelianism centered in Bologna. Thinkers like Siger of Brabant and Boethius of Dacia pushed Aristotle further than Aquinas allowed. They argued that human reason was autonomous and did not need theology to complete it. This was dangerous territory in the 13th century, and the Church condemned several of these positions. Yet Dante placed Siger of Brabant in paradise, among the wise in the heaven of the sun. This placement has puzzled scholars for centuries. The most convincing reading is that Dante respected the dignity of pure philosophical inquiry. He disagreed with its ultimate conclusions, but honoured the seriousness of the attempt. Beyond formal philosophy, Dante was shaped by a poetic movement called the Dolce Stil Novo. This was a group of Florentine and Italian poets who transformed love poetry into philosophical investigation. The key figure before Dante was Guido Cavalcanti, his close friend and intellectual rival. Cavalcanti wrote a famous poem arguing that love was essentially a biological force, rooted in sensory appetite. On this view, love overwhelmed reason and operated in darkness, beyond conscious control. Cavalcanti's position was materialist, in the strongest medieval sense of the word. Dante rejected this account completely. For him, love was not blind biology, but the engine that drove the mind upward toward truth. This disagreement with Cavalcanti is not a footnote. It is the seed from which the entire Divine Comedy grows. Dante also studied under Brunetto Latini, a Florentine statesman and encyclopedist who had written a major work of popular education. From Latini, Dante inherited the conviction that knowledge should not be locked behind Latin walls. This conviction later drove Dante to write the Convivio, his philosophical banquet, in Italian rather than Latin. He explicitly compared himself to someone sitting at the feet of the great scholars, collecting crumbs of knowledge. But his purpose was radical: to pass those crumbs to ordinary Italian readers who had no access to universities. This was an act of intellectual democratization nearly 2 centuries before the printing press. One more influence deserves attention, and it is often overlooked. Dante was deeply shaped by the Roman political tradition, especially Virgil and Cicero. Virgil was not merely a literary hero to Dante. He represented the highest achievement of human reason without revelation. That is exactly why Virgil guides Dante through hell and purgatory, but cannot enter paradise. Cicero, meanwhile, provided Dante with the model of the philosopher engaged in public life. Dante read Cicero's works on friendship and consolation during the painful years after Beatrice's death. From both Roman thinkers, Dante took the idea that philosophy was not an ivory tower exercise. It was a practice that had to serve the common good, or it failed its own purpose. So the forge that made Dante's mind was not a single flame, but several fires burning at once. Aristotle gave him the tools of logic and the concept of natural purpose. Aquinas showed him how reason and faith could coexist without destroying each other. Neoplatonism gave him a cosmic architecture of descending and ascending light. Radical Aristotelianism taught him to respect the sovereignty of philosophical inquiry itself. The Stil Novo poets forced him to think about whether love was blind instinct or intelligent desire. And the Roman tradition gave him the conviction that ideas must serve actual human communities. No single influence explains Dante. The power of his system comes from the tension between all of them held together in one mind. Part 2. The Architecture of the Soul. Dante inherited a model of the soul from Aristotle, but he rebuilt it for his own purposes. To understand anything else in his system, you must first understand this inner architecture. For Dante, the soul was not a single thing, but a layered structure with distinct powers. Each layer had its own function, its own objects, and its own way of failing. The foundation was the vegetative soul, shared with all living things, including plants. This layer governed growth, nutrition, and reproduction, the basic operations of biological life. Above it sat the sensitive soul, shared with animals, which handled perception and appetite. This layer received information from the five senses and generated emotional responses to that information. At the top was the intellectual soul, unique to human beings, which processed abstract thought. This was the layer that could grasp universal principles, do mathematics, and contemplate God. Now, this three-part model came directly from Aristotle's De Anima. But Dante did not simply copy it. He stressed something Aristotle left somewhat ambiguous. For Dante, these three layers were not three separate souls stacked inside one body. They were three powers of a single unified soul, operating simultaneously in every moment. This distinction matters enormously for his ethics and his politics. If the soul were truly divided, a person could excuse immoral behavior as one part overriding another. But because the soul is unified, every act involves the whole person. You cannot sin with your appetites while your intellect stands innocently aside. Within the sensitive soul, Dante identified a sophisticated chain of internal processing. Sensory data from the external world first entered through the five outer senses. This raw data then passed to the common sense, which unified inputs from different senses into one perception. You see a flame and feel heat simultaneously. The common sense binds these into a single experience. Modern neuroscience calls this multisensory integration, and it occurs in brain regions like the superior colliculus. Dante had no knowledge of neurons, but his functional description maps onto real cognitive operations. After the common sense came the imagination, which Dante treated as the mind's internal workshop. The imagination could hold sensory images after the original objects were no longer present. It could also combine and recombine images in ways that had no external counterpart. You can picture a golden mountain even though no such thing exists in the world. Dante recognized that this power was both creative and dangerous. The imagination could serve the intellect by providing raw material for abstract reasoning. But it could also trap the mind in false representations that felt completely real. Several episodes in the Purgatorio show Dante experiencing involuntary visions that seize his imagination entirely. Next came the estimative power, which Dante drew from Avicenna's elaboration of Aristotle. This faculty made rapid automatic judgments about whether something was beneficial or harmful. A sheep perceives a wolf and immediately flees, not through reasoned analysis, but through estimation. This is strikingly close to what modern psychology calls fast automatic threat detection. The amygdala in the human brain performs exactly this function, evaluating danger before conscious thought engages. Dante understood that much of human behavior was driven by these pre-reflective judgments. The ethical question was whether the intellect could override them or whether they ruled by default. His entire moral system hinges on the answer being yes, but only through disciplined practice. Finally, there was memory, which Dante treated not as passive storage, but as an active power. Memory retained not just images, but the evaluations the estimative power had attached to them. You do not simply remember the wolf, You remember it as dangerous. This meant memory was already morally loaded before the intellect ever examined it. Dante grasped something that cognitive science has confirmed only in recent decades. Human memory is reconstructive, shaped by emotion and prior judgment, never a neutral recording. The implications for his ethics are direct. Habitual sin does not just repeat an action. It rewrites memory itself, making the sinful choice feel increasingly natural and inevitable. Above all these sensitive powers stood the intellect, divided into two operations. The first was the possible intellect, which received and understood abstract forms or universal concepts. The second was the agent intellect, which actively extracted those universals from sensory particulars. When you see many individual triangles and grasp the concept of triangularity itself, the agent intellect has done its work. This distinction came from Aristotle, but it generated one of the fiercest debates in medieval philosophy. The Arab philosopher Averroes argued that the agent intellect was not individual, but one for all humanity. On that reading, individual humans do not truly think. They participate in a single cosmic mind. Dante rejected this in the Purgatorio and the comedy's theological framework, insisting each soul has its own intellect. Yet Dante did something remarkable with the idea of collective intellect in De Monarchia. He argued that humanity's purpose was to actualize the total capacity of the possible intellect. No single person could achieve this. It required the entire human species working across time. This is not Averroism, because Dante still held that each individual has a personal intellect. But it borrows the scope of the Averroes vision and redirects it toward a political argument. Universal peace is necessary because only in peace can all humans develop their intellectual potential simultaneously. The actualization of the species' intellect is not a mystical idea in Dante's hands. It is a concrete political demand for the conditions that make collective thinking possible. One more element of Dante's cognitive architecture deserves close attention: the role of light. Throughout his system, understanding is consistently described as a kind of illumination. This is not merely metaphorical. Dante took the analogy between light and knowledge seriously at a structural level. Just as physical light makes visible objects actually visible, intellectual light makes intelligible objects actually knowable. The agent intellect operates on sensory data the way sunlight operates on a dark room. Without it, the forms embedded in matter remain hidden, just as colours vanish in total darkness. This light metaphysics runs from the lowest cognitive operation all the way up to the vision of God. In the final canto of Paradiso, understanding and light become literally indistinguishable. Part 3. Free Will and the Problem of Desire. Free will is not a side topic in Dante's philosophy. It is the central pillar. Without it, his entire moral system, his politics, and his theology collapse into incoherence. In his letter to Can Grande della Scala, Dante defined the subject of the Divine Comedy explicitly. The poem concerns humanity as subject to the rewards and punishments of justice through freedom of the will. Every circle of hell, every terrace of purgatory, every sphere of paradise assumes one thing: human beings choose, and those choices carry real, permanent consequences. But what exactly does Dante mean by free will, and how does it actually operate? The answer requires separating two things that most people conflate: will and desire. For Dante, every human being is driven by a natural love that is never wrong in itself. This natural love is the soul's innate orientation toward the good, implanted by God at creation. It operates automatically, like gravity pulling a stone downward, requiring no conscious decision. You do not choose to want happiness. The wanting is built into your nature as a rational being. Above this natural love sits elective love, and here is where freedom enters. Elective love is the soul's capacity to direct itself toward specific objects that it judges to be good. The intellect presents options to the will. The will then either accepts or rejects them. This is the crucial moment of freedom, the hinge on which all moral responsibility turns. Dante explains this process most clearly in Purgatorio, Canto 18, through the voice of Virgil. Virgil tells Dante that the mind, created ready to love, moves toward anything that pleases it. Once a real object activates this disposition, the mind inclines toward it like a flame rising upward. But the inclination is not yet consent. Between attraction and action stands the power of judgment. This is where Dante parts ways with his friend Cavalcanti at the deepest level. Cavalcanti had argued that love was an overwhelming force, originating in sensory appetite. On Cavalcanti's view, when the sensitive soul locked onto an object of desire, reason was powerless. Love operated beneath consciousness like a biological compulsion, leaving the intellect in darkness. Dante found this position philosophically unacceptable because it destroyed moral responsibility. If desire simply happens to you, then punishment for acting on it is unjust. And if punishment is unjust, the entire structure of divine justice becomes arbitrary cruelty. Dante needed free will not to comfort himself, but to keep his system logically consistent. So Dante introduced what he called the innate faculty of counsel, or the noble virtue. This faculty sits between desire and consent, functioning as a threshold that all impulses must cross. When the sensitive soul presents an attractive object, this faculty holds the response in suspension. It creates a gap between stimulus and action where rational evaluation can occur. Modern psychology would recognize this as executive function, managed primarily by the prefrontal cortex. Dante had no neuroscience, but he identified the functional requirement with remarkable precision. Without this pause between desire and action, human beings would be no different from animals. With it, they become the only creatures in the cosmos capable of genuine moral agency. But Dante was not naive about the difficulty of exercising this freedom. He understood that repeated choices in one direction create habits that progressively narrow future options. This is exactly how he explains the deepening severity of sin as one descends through hell. The souls in upper hell, punished for sins of incontinence, failed to resist overwhelming passions. Their will was real, but weak, overpowered by desires they did not cultivate deliberately. The souls in lower hell committed sins of deliberate malice, where the intellect actively served evil purposes. The distinction is not just moral, but cognitive. Incontinence is a failure of impulse control. Malice is a corruption of the reasoning process itself. There is a further subtlety that most readers miss entirely. Dante held that the will can never choose something it understands to be purely evil. The will always aims at some perceived good, even when it is catastrophically mistaken about what is good. The glutton pursues the genuine good of sensory pleasure, but pursues it to a disordered degree. The tyrant pursues the genuine good of order, but through violence that destroys the order it claims to serve. Every sin in Dante's system is a misdirection of love, not an absence of it. This principle has enormous consequences. It means evil is not a positive force in the universe, but a distortion of something originally good. Dante inherited this idea from Augustine, who argued that evil has no independent existence. Evil is a privation, a hole in the fabric of goodness, not a thread of its own. But Dante went beyond Augustine by giving this idea a precise psychological mechanism. The mechanism is error in the estimative and intellectual faculties working together. When the estimative power misjudges an object's value, and the intellect fails to correct the misjudgment, the will follows the incorrect assessment and chooses what appears good but is actually harmful. Sin is therefore a species of cognitive failure, not merely a weakness of moral fibre. This makes Dante's ethics genuinely cognitive, linking moral failure to failures of perception and reasoning. One of the most daring aspects of Dante's position is his treatment of the will's relationship to God. In Paradiso, Piccarda Donati explains that the souls in the lowest heaven are entirely content with their station. She says their wills are at rest, because their wills are aligned with what God wills for them. This sounds like the elimination of freedom, but Dante insists it is freedom's highest expression. True freedom is not the ability to choose anything at random. True freedom is the state in which the will perfectly desires what is genuinely best for it. A will enslaved to disordered appetites is less free, not more, even though it appears to have more options. This aligns with the tradition running from Plato through the Stoics to modern thinkers like Harry Frankfurt. Dante recognized that this position raises a hard objection. If true freedom means wanting only what is truly good, and God determines what is truly good, then does freedom simply mean agreeing with a program you had no part in designing? Dante's answer is that the soul is not forced into agreement, but discovers agreement through understanding. The more clearly you see reality, the more naturally your will conforms to it. Compulsion comes from ignorance. Consent comes from knowledge. This is why education, philosophy, and proper government are not luxuries in Dante's system. They are the necessary infrastructure of human freedom itself. Part 4. The Moral Anatomy. The structure of hell in the Divine Comedy is not a random catalogue of punishments. It is a precise moral classification system built on Aristotelian and Ciceronian foundations. Most readers treat Dante's Inferno as a horror show, focused on the spectacular torments. But the torments are symptoms. The underlying logic is a rigorous theory of ethical failure. Dante divides sin into three fundamental categories that determine the architecture of hell itself. The first category is incontinence, the failure to moderate natural and legitimate desires. The second is violence or bestiality, the use of force to harm others, oneself, or God. The third is fraud, the deliberate use of reason to deceive and manipulate other human beings. These three categories are not arbitrary groupings, but reflect an increasing corruption of what makes us human. Incontinence abuses appetite, violence abuses strength, fraud abuses intellect. Since the intellect is the highest human faculty, its misuse constitutes the gravest moral offence. This is why the deepest circles of hell are reserved for fraudsters and traitors, not for murderers. Dante drew this hierarchy primarily from Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, Book 7. Aristotle distinguished between incontinence, viciousness, and brutishness as three forms of moral deficiency. Incontinence was the least severe because the person knows what is right, but fails to do it. The incontinent person's rational judgment remains intact. Only the will is too weak to follow it. Viciousness was worse because the person's rational judgment itself has been corrupted. The vicious person genuinely believes that the wrong action is the right one. Dante mapped these Aristotelian categories onto a Ciceronian framework from De Officiis. Cicero had argued that fraud was more contemptible than force because it violated trust, the basis of society. The combination of Aristotle and Cicero produced Dante's unique moral map. Upper Hell, circles 2 through 5, contains the incontinent, the lustful, gluttonous, avaricious, and wrathful. These sinners are punished, but Dante often shows sympathy toward them. Their souls are intact in structure. They simply lack the discipline to govern their appetites. The famous episode of Paolo and Francesca in Circle 2 illustrates this perfectly. Francesca describes how reading a love story together swept them into adultery almost involuntarily. Dante, the pilgrim, faints with pity after hearing her account. This pity is morally significant because it shows he has not yet learned to separate compassion from moral clarity. Below the city of Dis, which marks the boundary of upper and lower hell, the sins become deliberate. Circle 6 holds the heretics, those who used intellect to deny fundamental truths about the soul and God. Circle 7 holds the violent, divided into 3 rings by their targets: neighbours, self, and God. Violence against neighbours is murder and war. Violence against self is suicide and self-destruction. Violence against God includes blasphemy, but also sodomy and usury in Dante's specific framework. The grouping of sodomy and usury with blasphemy strikes modern readers as bizarre or bigoted. But Dante's logic was precise. All 3 were understood as violations of nature or natural productivity. Blasphemy rejects God directly. The others reject the natural order God established for human flourishing. Circles 8 and 9 hold the fraudulent, and here Dante's moral anatomy becomes most intricate. Circle 8, called Malbolge, meaning evil ditches, contains 10 distinct subcategories of fraud. Seducers, flatterers, corrupt clergy who sold spiritual offices, fortune-tellers, corrupt politicians. grafters, hypocrites, thieves, deceitful counselors, sowers of discord, and falsifiers of various kinds. Each subcategory targets a specific form of trust that the sinner violated through deliberate deception. The seducer abused erotic trust. The corrupt clergyman abused spiritual trust. The politician abused civic trust. What unifies them is that everyone weaponized the rational faculty against its proper purpose. Reason exists to illuminate truth. These sinners used it to manufacture lies for personal advantage. Circle 9, the bottom of hell, holds the traitors frozen in a lake of ice rather than burned by fire. The ice is symbolically perfect. Treachery is the coldest sin because it requires the most calculated deliberation. Fire represents passion and appetite, forces that at least show life and energy. Ice represents the total absence of warmth, love, and connection to other beings. The traitors are divided by the relationship they betrayed: family, country, guests, and benefactors. At the absolute center, Satan chews on Judas, Brutus, and Cassius in his 3 mouths. Judas betrayed his spiritual lord. Brutus and Cassius betrayed their political lord. This placement reveals Dante's conviction that the 2 worst possible crimes are betraying God and betraying the empire. Now, here is the deeper principle that most commentary misses. The punishment in every case is not an arbitrary torture assigned by an angry God. It is the sin itself made visible and permanent, a concept called contrapasso. The lustful are blown about by winds because in life they let passion blow them off course. The fortune-tellers have their heads twisted backward because they tried to see the future instead of the present. The traitors are frozen because they froze out all human warmth and loyalty in their relationships. Contrapasso means the punishment is not applied from outside. It is the logical and inevitable consequence of the sin fully expressed in eternity. This principle has a startling implication that connects Dante to modern behavioral science. If punishment is just the full expression of a pattern you chose in life, then hell is self-created. The souls are not in hell because God is vengeful, but because their choices locked them into a permanent state. They became their sin so completely that the sin became their entire identity. Modern addiction research shows something structurally similar. Repeated behavior reshapes neural pathways. Over time, the addicted brain does not simply want the substance. It reorganizes itself around obtaining it. Dante understood this process 7 centuries before neuroplasticity had a name. His hell is the end point of a process that begins with small, seemingly harmless failures of self-governance. One important critique of Dante's moral system comes from the proportionality problem. Is it truly just that a single human lifetime of sin produces an eternity of punishment? Dante never fully resolves this tension, and it remains one of the genuine cracks in his system. His implicit answer is that the damned souls actively refuse repentance even in hell. Their punishment is eternal because their rejection of God is eternal, sustained by their own frozen wills. But this raises a recursive question. If their wills are frozen, can they truly be said to choose rejection? Scholars have debated this for centuries without reaching consensus. The most charitable reading is that Dante saw damnation as a point of no return in moral self-formation. Past a certain threshold of habitual evil, the soul loses the capacity to want to change. Part 5. Purgation and Moral Psychology. Hell shows what happens when moral development fails permanently. Purgatory shows how moral development actually works when it succeeds. This makes the Purgatorio the most psychologically sophisticated part of the entire comedy. It is Dante's extended treatise on how human beings change at the deepest level. The mountain of Purgatory has 7 terraces, each corresponding to one of the 7 capital vices. From bottom to top, pride, envy, wrath, sloth, avarice, gluttony, and lust. This ordering is not random. It follows a precise logic of disordered love. Dante explains this through Marco Lombardo and Virgil in the central cantos of the Purgatorio. The first 3 terraces address love directed at the wrong object. Pride loves the self excessively above others. Envy loves harm to others because their good seems to diminish your own. Wrath loves vengeance, as if justice were a personal possession rather than a universal principle. These are sins of perverted love, where the soul aims at something genuinely harmful. The 4th terrace, sloth, occupies the exact middle of the mountain, and this placement is deliberate. Sloth is not laziness in the modern sense of sitting on a couch, avoiding chores. For Dante, sloth is deficient love, a failure to pursue the good with sufficient energy and commitment. It is the most insidious vice because it does not actively choose evil. It simply fails to choose good. The slothful souls run ceaselessly on their terrace, compensating for the motion they refused in life. Sloth sits at the centre because it is the 0 point between misdirected love and excessive love. The upper 3 terraces address love directed at legitimate goods but in excessive measure. Avarice loves material wealth beyond what is needed for a good life. Gluttony loves the pleasure of food and drink beyond the body's actual requirements. Lust loves sexual pleasure beyond the bounds that reason and relationship set for it. These are not wrong in their object. Wealth, food, and sexuality are genuine goods. They become sinful only when pursued so intensely that they crowd out higher goods. This distinction between perverted, deficient, and excessive love is Dante's master key to moral psychology. Every possible human failing can be classified using these 3 categories of disordered desire. Now, the mechanics of purgation itself reveal Dante's theory of behavioral change. On each terrace, souls undergo 3 simultaneous processes that work together to transform them. First, they experience a physical discipline that directly counteracts the pattern of their vice. The proud carry enormous stones on their backs, forced into the humility their pride rejected. The envious have their eyes sewn shut with iron wire, unable to see what provoked their envy. The gluttonous walk past fragrant fruit trees without eating, rebuilding their relationship to desire. These disciplines are not punishments in the way hell's torments are punishments. They are exercises, the way physical therapy rebuilds a damaged muscle through targeted repetition. Second, Each terrace presents examples of the corresponding virtue to meditate upon. The proud contemplate carvings showing perfect humility, including the Virgin Mary and King David. They also contemplate carvings showing the catastrophic results of pride, including Satan's fall. This dual presentation of positive and negative examples is a precise pedagogical method. Modern behavioral psychology calls this approach modeling, learning through observation of outcomes in others. Dante understood that abstract moral instruction alone rarely changes deep behavioral patterns. You need concrete examples that engage the imagination and the emotions, not just the intellect. The carvings on the terraces do exactly this. They bypass abstract reasoning and imprint directly on the sensitive soul. Third, and this is the element most overlooked, each terrace involves a prayer. The proud recite the Lord's Prayer with special emphasis on submission to divine will. Prayer in this context is not a magical formula, but a deliberate reorientation of attention and desire. It works on the principle that what you repeatedly direct your mind toward reshapes your dispositions. Cognitive science has a name for this: attentional training, and it produces measurable changes in neural activity. Repeated focused attention on specific values and goals strengthens the neural pathways associated with those goals. Dante built this insight into purgatory structure 700 years before brain imaging confirmed it. The combination of physical discipline, example-based learning, and attentional reorientation is a complete behavior change program. There is a crucial difference between hell and purgatory that reveals Dante's deepest psychological insight. In hell, souls retain their sinful identities perfectly and forever. They are their sins. In purgatory, souls are in the process of becoming something other than what they were. This means purgatory is the only place in the comedy where genuine psychological change occurs. Hell is a museum of frozen states. Paradise is a display of completed perfections. Only purgatory shows the messy, painful, gradual process of transformation itself. Dante marks the completion of purgation with a specific event at the top of the mountain. Virgil declares that Dante's will is now free, upright, and whole. The Italian words are libero, dritto, and sano, and each carries precise meaning. Free means no longer enslaved to disordered habit. Upright means correctly oriented toward genuine good. Whole means that intellect, will, and appetite are working in harmony rather than at war. This is not the elimination of desire, but the integration of desire with reason and moral purpose. Dante's model of psychological health is not stoic suppression of emotion. It is the condition where emotion, reason, and choice all point in the same direction. One of the most interesting implications connects to modern debates about willpower and self-control. Contemporary psychology has oscillated between two models of how people regulate their behavior. The strength model says willpower is a limited resource that gets depleted through use. The skill model says self-control is a learned competence that improves with practice. Dante's Purgatory clearly operates on the skill model. The souls do not exhaust their willpower through grueling resistance. They build new capacities through structured repetition. Each terrace is a training ground, not a test of endurance. The goal is not to suffer enough to earn release, but to practice enough to acquire genuine virtue. Dante also understood something about the relationship between community and moral change. The souls in purgatory help each other in ways that the souls in hell never can. They pray for one another, share stories of transformation, and encourage those behind them on the path. This is not sentimental. It reflects Dante's Aristotelian conviction that virtue requires social context. You cannot become fully good in isolation, because many virtues, like justice and generosity, require other people. Purgatory is structured as a community of practice, where mutual support accelerates individual transformation. Hell, by contrast, is the final state of isolation, souls trapped in their own narratives, unable to help or be helped. The difference is not just theological, it is a statement about the social conditions necessary for psychological growth. Part 6. The Political Vision. Dante's political philosophy is concentrated in De Monarchia, written around 1312 to 1313. But it runs through all his major works, including every sixth canto of the Divine Comedy. In Inferno 6, he addresses Florence. In Purgatorio 6, all of Italy. In Paradiso 6, the Roman Empire. The scope widens deliberately, moving from local corruption to national chaos to the universal political order. Dante was not a political hobbyist attaching opinions to a poem. He constructed a complete theory of government grounded in his metaphysics and his ethics. The argument of De Monarchia begins with a question that sounds abstract, but has concrete stakes. What is the proper end or purpose of the entire human race considered as a single collective? Dante's answer draws directly from Aristotle. The purpose of humanity is to actualize the total intellectual potential. Not some people's potential, not one nation's potential, but the complete capacity of the human species. This cannot happen during war, because war destroys the conditions needed for contemplation and study. It cannot happen under tyranny, because tyranny suppresses free inquiry and corrupts moral development. It can happen only under universal peace, maintained by a single governing authority over all temporal affairs. This is why Dante argues for a world monarchy. Not from love of emperors, but from logical necessity. The reasoning chain is tight and worth following step by step. Wherever multiple entities pursue competing goals, conflict arises and resources are wasted. Between rival kingdoms, there is no shared judge to resolve disputes without war. Between rival cities within kingdoms, the same problem recurs at a smaller scale. Only a supreme temporal authority with jurisdiction over all secular matters can adjudicate without violence. This authority must have no territorial ambitions of its own, because it already possesses everything. A monarch who rules the entire world has nothing left to covet, and therefore governs with maximum impartiality. Greed distorts judgment. The absence of greed allows justice to operate cleanly. This argument anticipated Thomas Hobbes by over 300 years. Hobbes argued in Leviathan that a sovereign authority was needed to prevent the war of all against all. But Dante's argument differs from Hobbes in a critical respect. Hobbes grounded sovereignty in fear, people submit to the sovereign to avoid violent death. Dante grounded sovereignty in purpose. People need the sovereign so they can fulfill their intellectual potential. For Hobbes, peace is the absence of violence. For Dante, peace is the presence of conditions for human flourishing. This is closer to what modern political theory calls positive peace, as distinct from mere negative peace. Dante's vision is not just about stopping wars, but about creating the global structure that makes wisdom possible. The second book of De Monarchia argues that the Roman Empire held legitimate universal authority. This section is the weakest philosophically and the most bound to its historical moment. Dante argues that Roman supremacy was proven by military victories that constituted a kind of divine judgment. The logic is that God would not have allowed Rome to conquer the world unless Rome deserved to rule it. This is essentially a might makes right argument dressed in theological clothing, and it has been rightly criticized for centuries. Hans Kelsen, the great 20th century legal theorist, wrote his first book analyzing and dismantling this section. Kelsen showed that Dante confused descriptive facts about Roman history with normative claims about political legitimacy. Just because Rome won does not mean Rome should have won, or that its authority was just. But the third book of De Monarchia contains Dante's most radical and historically consequential argument. He directly attacks the papal claim to supreme authority over both spiritual and temporal affairs. The papacy of Dante's time, especially under Boniface VIII, claimed that all power derived from the Pope. The emperor ruled only as a delegate of papal authority, a subordinate with no independent mandate. Dante demolished this claim with a series of precise logical and scriptural arguments. He showed that the biblical passage used to justify papal supremacy, the two swords passage in Luke, did not support the reading the papacy gave it. He showed that the so-called donation of Constantine, by which the emperor allegedly gave temporal authority to the Pope, was illegitimate even if genuine. A sitting emperor cannot alienate the authority of the empire because that authority belongs to the office, not the person. Dante's core principle was the dual nature of human existence and its political implications. Human beings have two ends: earthly happiness and heavenly salvation. Earthly happiness is achieved through philosophy and the moral virtues, guided by rational government. Heavenly salvation is achieved through theological virtues and spiritual guidance, administered by the Church. Each end requires its own independent authority: the emperor for temporal matters, the Pope for spiritual matters. Neither derives authority from the other. Both derive authority directly from God. This is a genuine separation of church and state, argued in 1313. It predates the Peace of Westphalia by over 300 years and the American First Amendment by nearly 500. The political implications of this separation were explosive, and the Church knew it. De Monarchia was banned by the Catholic Church, placed on the Index of Forbidden Books in 1585. It was not removed from the index until 1881. The Church understood that Dante's argument, if accepted, stripped the papacy of its temporal power entirely. And Dante intended exactly that. He believed that the Church's involvement in politics had corrupted both the Church and the political order. The papacy had become a worldly power, pursuing wealth and territorial control instead of saving souls. Dante placed multiple popes in hell, including Boniface VIII, to make this point unforgettable. Now, the practical structure Dante envisioned was not a centralized dictatorship. The world monarch would handle disputes between kingdoms and maintain universal peace. But local and regional governments would retain substantial autonomy over their own affairs. Different peoples have different customs, different climates, different needs that require locally adapted laws. The monarch's role was to provide the framework within which local governance could operate freely. This resembles modern federalism more than it resembles any form of totalitarian empire. Scholars have noted the structural similarity between Dante's model and contemporary ideas about world federalism. The European Union, the United Nations Charter, and international law all echo aspects of this architecture. But Dante's political vision has real limitations that must be acknowledged honestly. He assumed that a single human ruler could be free of all greed simply by possessing everything. This is psychologically naive. History shows that unlimited power generates its own forms of corruption. Lord Acton's observation that power tends to corrupt applies precisely to the scenario Dante imagined. Dante also assumed a unified Christendom as the political context for his world order. He had no framework for religious pluralism, competing civilizations, or secular societies. His political vision was also exclusively male and aristocratic in its assumptions about who participates in governance. Women and common labourers appear nowhere in his theory of political agency. Perhaps the deepest tension in Dante's political thought is between his universalism and his particularism. He argued for a universal human community governed by a single rational principle of justice. But he also mourned the destruction of specific local traditions, Florentine identity, and Italian culture. He wanted both a world government and the preservation of local distinctiveness. This tension is not a flaw unique to Dante. It is the central unresolved problem of all global political theory. Every serious proposal for international governance since 1313 has struggled with the same friction. Dante's honesty in holding both commitments simultaneously, without pretending they resolve easily, is itself a contribution. He showed that the problem is real and that ignoring either side of it leads to disaster. One final element of Dante's political philosophy deserves emphasis because it is routinely ignored. He argued that the purpose of government is to serve citizens, not to rule over them. The monarch exists for the people, not the people for the monarch. Consuls exist for the citizens, and a king exists for his people, not the reverse. This is a proto-social contract idea articulated 2 centuries before the concept gained traction in European thought. Dante combined it with the Aristotelian principle that the state exists to promote the good life, not merely to prevent harm. Government that merely keeps order without actively fostering intellectual and moral development has failed its purpose. This makes Dante's political philosophy not just a theory of power, but a theory of human development through institutional design. Part 7. Justice as Cosmic Infrastructure. Justice is not one theme among many in Dante's work, it is the organizing principle of his entire universe. The physical structure of the cosmos, the moral structure of the afterlife, and the political structure of human society all follow from a single theory of justice. For most thinkers, justice is a human concern, a social arrangement we construct to manage conflict. For Dante, justice is built into the fabric of reality itself, operating at every scale from the individual soul to the motion of the stars. Dante's concept of divine justice rests on a simple but powerful foundation. God created the universe as an expression of perfect goodness, and every being receives exactly what its nature allows it to receive. The angels receive the most because their natures are the most open to divine light. Animals receive less because their natures lack the intellectual capacity for self-reflection. Humans occupy the middle position, capable of receiving more than animals but less than angels. Justice, in this cosmic sense, is the proper distribution of goodness according to capacity. It is not equal distribution, but proportional distribution, each being getting what fits its nature. This is Aristotle's distributive justice, scaled to the size of the entire created order. In the human world, this cosmic justice manifests as the moral law. The moral law is not an arbitrary set of commands imposed by divine whim. It is the set of requirements that follow necessarily from what human beings are. Humans are rational, social, free beings with both physical and spiritual needs. The moral law articulates what it takes for such beings to flourish, given their actual nature. Murder violates justice not because God dislikes it, but because it destroys a being capable of reaching its full potential. Fraud violates justice more severely because it corrupts the very faculty, reason, that defines humanity. The ordering of sins in hell follows this logic. Worse sins damage higher human capacities. Retributive justice in Dante's system operates through the principle of contrapasso already discussed. But there is a distributive dimension in paradise that balances it, and that most readers overlook. The souls in paradise are arranged not by punishment, but by the degree of beatitude they enjoy. The lowest heaven contains souls who were good, but whose capacity for divine joy was limited by their circumstances. The highest heavens contain souls whose moral and intellectual development allowed them the greatest openness to God. Every soul is perfectly happy, but not every soul is happy to the same degree. This is not unfairness. It is the natural result of what each soul made of itself during its earthly life. A small cup and a large cup can both be completely full, but they hold different amounts. This metaphor of cups of different sizes is Dante's solution to one of the hardest problems in theological ethics. How can heaven be perfectly just if some souls enjoy more blessedness than others? The answer is that capacity itself is something you develop through your choices in life. The choices you make expand or contract your ability to receive goodness. A soul that spent its life cultivating wisdom and virtue arrives in paradise with an enormous capacity for joy. A soul that lived decently but without great depth arrives with a smaller but still fully satisfied capacity. Neither soul envies the other because each is complete according to its own measure. This eliminates envy from paradise without eliminating genuine differences in achievement. But Dante's system of justice cracks at a specific point, and he knew it. The problem of the virtuous pagan haunted him throughout the comedy and never receives a fully satisfying resolution. Virgil, Dante's guide and intellectual hero, was one of the greatest minds in human history. Yet Virgil is consigned to limbo, the first circle of hell, because he lived before Christ and was never baptized. He suffers no physical torment, but is permanently excluded from the joy of seeing God. Dante clearly loved Virgil and considered this exclusion tragic, yet his theological system demanded it. The problem becomes even sharper in Paradiso, Canto 19, where Dante directly raises the objection. He asks how it can be just that a person born on the banks of the Indus River, who never heard of Christ, who lived a perfectly virtuous life by the light of reason alone, should be denied salvation. The answer he receives from the eagle of divine justice is essentially that God's justice exceeds human understanding. We cannot fully comprehend the criteria by which God judges, and some who seem excluded may not be. This is not a satisfying philosophical answer. It is an appeal to mystery at precisely the point where the system needs clarity. Dante was honest enough to show the fracture rather than paper over it with false confidence. Scholars have debated whether Dante believed in the possibility of salvation for virtuous pagans. Two figures in the comedy suggest he at least hoped for it: Cato of Utica and the Emperor Trajan. Cato, a pagan who chose death over tyranny, guards the entrance to purgatory rather than residing in limbo. Trajan, a pagan emperor, appears in paradise because medieval legend held that Pope Gregory prayed him out of hell. These placements are not accidents. They are deliberate signals that Dante found his own system too rigid on this point. He could not bring himself to condemn absolute moral integrity to permanent exclusion from God. But he also could not explicitly override the theological framework he had committed himself to. The result is a tension that makes the comedy more intellectually honest than a cleaner resolution would have. There is a connection here to modern debates about moral luck, a concept formalized by philosophers Bernard Williams and Thomas Nagel. Moral luck refers to factors that affect moral judgment, but lie outside the agent's control. Being born before Christ or outside Christendom is the ultimate case of moral luck in Dante's system. The virtuous pagan did everything right, but was born in the wrong place or time. Modern ethics generally holds that morality should not depend on circumstances beyond one's control. By that standard, Dante's limbo is unjust, and Dante himself seemed to feel its injustice deeply. His inability to resolve this problem reveals the boundary where his theological commitments overrode his philosophical ones. It is the one place where the system refuses to fully cohere, and that refusal itself tells us something important about the limits of any total worldview. Part 8. The Shape of Everything. Dante's universe is not a backdrop for his story. It is an argument made of geometry. The physical structure of the cosmos in the Divine Comedy encodes his metaphysics directly into spatial form. Every distance, every boundary, every direction in his universe carries philosophical meaning. To understand his cosmology is to understand his entire system, expressed as architecture. Dante adopted the standard Ptolemaic model of his time, with Earth fixed at the center. 9 concentric celestial spheres surround the Earth, each one larger and faster than the one below it. The innermost sphere is the Moon, followed by Mercury, Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Above Saturn lies the sphere of the fixed stars, and above that the primum mobile, the first move sphere. The primum mobile is the outermost physical boundary of the material universe. It rotates faster than any other sphere because it is closest to the source of all motion, which is God. Beyond the primum mobile lies the empyrean, which is not a physical sphere at all. It is pure light, pure love, and pure intellectual reality, the dwelling place of God and the blessed souls. Now, here is where Dante's cosmology becomes genuinely extraordinary. The material universe has Earth at its centre and expands outward toward the primum mobile. But the spiritual universe has God at its centre and expands outward through 9 rings of angelic choirs. These two systems appear to be structured in opposite directions, one centred on Earth, the other on God. In Canto 28 of Paradiso, Beatrice explains how these two structures form a single unified cosmos. The smallest, fastest ring of angels is closest to God, corresponding to the largest, fastest physical sphere. The largest angelic ring corresponds to the smallest physical sphere nearest to Earth. The two hierarchies are inversions of each other, but they are the same hierarchy seen from two perspectives. Mathematically, what Dante described is a structure now called a three-sphere. A three-sphere is a higher dimensional analogue of the surface of an ordinary ball. On the surface of the Earth, if you travel in one direction without stopping, you return to your starting point. The surface is finite, but has no edge, no boundary where you fall off. Dante's universe works the same way, but in one higher dimension. If you could travel outward through the material spheres past the primum mobile, you would enter the spiritual spheres. Continue through the spiritual spheres, and you would eventually return to the material world from the other side. The universe is finite in volume, but has no outer wall, no edge, no empty space beyond it. In 1917, Albert Einstein used exactly this three-sphere topology as the basis for his first cosmological model. Einstein's static universe was a finite, unbounded, positively curved space with the geometry of a three-sphere. There is no evidence that Einstein read Dante's Paradiso, and the mathematical framework came from Bernhard Riemann. But the structural identity between Dante's poetic cosmos and Einstein's mathematical one is genuine, not forced. Both men face the same problem: how to conceive a universe that is complete and self-contained without having an edge. Dante solved it through theological and poetic intuition 600 years before the mathematics existed to formalize it. This does not make Dante a scientist, but it demonstrates the depth of his spatial imagination. He was thinking about the topology of totality with tools no one in his century possessed. Dante's cosmology also embedded a theory of causation that ran from top to bottom. God, as the unmoved mover, causes the primum mobile to rotate through the force of divine love. The primum mobile then transmits motion to each successively lower sphere through the angelic intelligences. Each sphere is governed by a specific order of angels who receive divine influence and pass it downward. By the time this causal chain reaches the Earth, it has been filtered through 9 levels of cosmic mediation. The sublunary world, everything beneath the moon, is the realm of change, decay, and imperfection. Above the moon, the celestial spheres are incorruptible and eternal. Below it, matter is mutable and mortal. This distinction between the corruptible and the incorruptible mapped perfectly onto Dante's moral framework. The physics embedded in Dante's poem was not primitive by the standards of his century. He understood gravity as a force drawing all heavy things toward the centre of the earth. In Inferno, Canto 34, when Dante and Virgil pass the centre of the earth climbing over Satan's body, Virgil explains that they have passed the point to which all weights are drawn from every direction. Dante recognized the spherical symmetry of gravitational attraction 3 centuries before Newton formalized it. He also engaged seriously with optics, discussing reflection, refraction, and the behavior of light in multiple passages. In Paradiso, Canto 2, Beatrice corrects Dante's incorrect explanation of the moon's dark spots using an argument about differential light reflection. She even proposes an experiment with 3 mirrors at different distances to demonstrate her point. But Dante's physics served his metaphysics, not the other way around. The material universe existed in order to express spiritual realities in visible, tangible form. The planets did not influence human behavior through occult astrological forces in any mechanical sense. Rather, the celestial spheres were stages on which divine qualities were displayed for human contemplation. The sphere of the sun displayed wisdom, Mars displayed courage, Jupiter displayed justice. These associations were not arbitrary, but followed from the angelic intelligence governing each sphere. The physical cosmos was a language through which God communicated the structure of goodness to beings capable of reading it. Dante's universe was simultaneously a physical mechanism and a book written in light. One implication of this cosmology deserves attention because it challenges modern assumptions about medieval thought. The common claim is that placing Earth at the centre of the universe reflected human arrogance and self-importance. For Dante, the opposite was true. The centre of his universe was the lowest point, the farthest from God, the place where matter was most degraded. Satan is frozen at the exact geometric centre of the earth, which is the exact centre of the cosmos. The centre is not a throne, it is a drain. The most exalted position in Dante's universe is the outermost boundary, closest to the Empyrean and to God. Medieval geocentrism placed humanity not at the pinnacle of importance, but at the bottom of a cosmic hierarchy of perfection. This inversion has implications for how we read Dante's moral architecture spatially. Descending into hell means moving toward the centre, toward maximum density, coldness, and immobility. Ascending through purgatory and paradise means moving outward toward light, warmth, and infinite motion. The entire comedy is a journey from the centre to the periphery, from constriction to expansion. Sin contracts the soul, virtue expands it. Ignorance traps, knowledge liberates. The geometry of the journey is the argument. You do not need to extract a thesis from the poem because the poem's spatial structure is itself the thesis. Part 9. Love as the fundamental force. The last line of the Paradiso states that love is the force that moves the sun and the other stars. This is not a poetic flourish tacked onto the end of a long poem. It is the single most precise summary of Dante's entire philosophical system. Love, in Dante's framework, is not an emotion, not a sentiment, not a human feeling projected onto the cosmos. It is the fundamental force that holds reality together and drives every movement within it. Gravity, desire, moral aspiration, political cohesion, and cosmic rotation are all manifestations of one thing. To understand this, you must trace Dante's concept of love from its earliest expression to its final form. It begins in the Vita Nuova, written when Dante was around 30, as an account of his love for Beatrice Portinari. On the surface, this is a young man's story of romantic obsession with a woman he barely knew. Beatrice married another man, died at 24, and Dante spent the rest of his life writing about her. But even in the Vita Nuova, Dante was doing something no love poet before him had attempted. He was treating the experience of falling in love as data about the structure of reality itself. The key insight of the Vita Nuova is that love reveals something about the beloved that transcends the beloved. When Dante sees Beatrice, he does not merely perceive a beautiful woman. He perceives through her a quality of goodness and radiance that she herself participates in but does not own. She is beautiful because something divine shines through her particular form. This idea came from the Dolce Stil Novo tradition, but Dante pushed it further than any of his predecessors. For the Stil Novo poets, the beloved lady reflected divine beauty. For Dante, she actively transmitted it. Beatrice was not a mirror, but a lens, focusing divine light into a form the human mind could receive. This functional role is what allowed Dante to promote her from literary muse to theological guide in the comedy. Now, between the Vita Nuova and the comedy, Dante wrote the Convivio, where love underwent a transformation. After Beatrice's death, Dante turned to philosophy for consolation, specifically Boethius and Cicero. He discovered that the love he felt for philosophical wisdom had the same structure as his love for Beatrice. The mind, recognizing truth, produced the same response as the soul, recognizing beauty. Dante concluded that these were not two different loves, but one love directed at two manifestations of the same goodness. Philosophy became his lady, a donna Gentile who drew his mind upward just as Beatrice had drawn his heart. This identification of intellectual desire with erotic desire was Dante's most original move in the Convivio. It meant that the drive to know and the drive to love were the same force operating through different faculties. In the Divine Comedy, Dante completed the architecture by identifying love as the force that operates at every level of reality. At the lowest level, love is the natural appetite that draws all things toward their proper place. A stone falls because it loves the center of the earth, where its nature finds rest. Fire rises because it loves the sphere of fire above the atmosphere, its natural home. This is not metaphorical in Dante's system. It is literal. The physical tendency of matter to seek its proper place is love, expressed in the simplest possible form. At the animal level, love becomes sensitive appetite, the attraction to objects perceived through the senses. Animals pursue food, warmth, mates and safety because their sensitive souls love these things naturally. There is nothing wrong with this love. It is exactly what nature requires for survival and reproduction. But it operates without reflection, without choice, without the ability to evaluate its own direction. An animal cannot ask whether what it desires is truly good for it. It simply desires and pursues, governed entirely by the estimative faculty discussed earlier. At the human level, love becomes elective, passing through the intellect before reaching the will. This is where love becomes morally significant, because humans can choose what to love. But Dante insists that even this choice is driven by a deeper, unchosen love, the natural love of the good itself. You do not choose to want goodness. That orientation is hardwired into your soul by the act of creation. What you choose is which specific objects to treat as embodiments of that goodness. The miser and the saint both love goodness. The miser identifies it with gold, the saint with God. Every moral failure is a failure of identification, not a failure of love itself. Love never fails, only the aiming fails. At the cosmic level, love is the force by which God moves the entire universe without physical contact. God does not push the primum mobile like a hand turning a wheel. The primum mobile moves because it loves God, and desire for divine perfection draws it into perpetual rotation. Each lower sphere is moved by the sphere above it through the same mechanism of desire. The angelic intelligences governing each sphere contemplate God, and their desire to express what they contemplate produces motion. The entire physical universe is therefore a cascading system of love, translating itself into movement at every level. This is strikingly close to the Aristotelian concept of the unmoved mover, but Dante gave it emotional content that Aristotle never did. Aristotle's prime mover was an object of thought. Dante's God was an object of love, and the difference is not trivial. The connection to modern physics is limited, but worth stating precisely. Dante's love-driven cosmos is not a precursor to gravitational theory in any scientific sense. But there is a structural parallel worth noticing. In general relativity, mass does not push other objects. It curves the geometry of space-time, and objects follow that curvature. The attraction is not a force exerted across distance, but a property of the medium itself. In Dante's cosmos, love does not push anything either. It draws, it curves the will toward its source. Both systems replace mechanical causation with something more like a field effect, a shaping of the space in which things move. This parallel should not be overstated, but it illustrates that Dante was grappling with the same conceptual problem. How does influence operate without direct contact? The ultimate expression of love in Dante's system is the vision of God in the final canto of Paradiso. Dante sees three circles of light interpenetrating each other, representing the Trinity. Within the second circle, he perceives the image of a human face, representing the incarnation of Christ. He struggles to understand how the human image fits within the divine circle, how finite fits within infinite. His intellect fails, but at the very last moment his will and desire are moved directly by divine love. The final line describes this love as the force that moves the sun and the other stars. The poem ends not with understanding, but with alignment. The mind cannot comprehend God, but the will can be moved by the same love that moves everything else. This ending is an epistemological statement as much as a theological one. It means that the deepest truth about reality is not something you can know in the ordinary sense. It is something you can only participate in through the alignment of your desire with its ultimate object. Knowledge reaches a limit. Love does not. This is not anti-intellectualism, because Dante spent the entire poem celebrating the intellect's power. It is a precise mapping of where intellect ends and where a different mode of relation to reality begins. The mind brings you to the threshold. Love carries you across. Both are necessary, and neither alone is sufficient. Part 10. Language, Knowledge, and the Democratization of Truth. Dante was the first major European thinker to argue systematically that philosophy could be done in a common language. This claim, which seems obvious now, was revolutionary in the early 1400s. Latin was the language of all serious intellectual work across medieval Europe. Theology, law, natural philosophy, medicine, everything that mattered was written and debated in Latin. The vast majority of people, including many members of the nobility, could not read Latin. Knowledge was therefore structurally restricted to a clerical and academic elite by the medium in which it was expressed. Dante attacked this barrier on two fronts simultaneously. The first was theoretical. De Vulgari Eloquentia, written around 1303 to 1305, was the first sustained scholarly examination of vernacular language in Europe. Dante argued that the vernacular was not an inferior corruption of Latin, but a language in its own right. In fact, he claimed the vernacular was more natural than Latin, because every person learns it from birth without formal instruction. Latin was an artificial invented language, deliberately constructed by grammarians to create stability across time and space. The vernacular was the living, breathing language of real human communities, closer to natural expression. This reversal of the hierarchy between Latin and vernacular was linguistically radical. It anticipated Ferdinand de Saussure's distinction between language as a living system and language as a formal code by 600 years. But Dante did not celebrate just any vernacular usage. He searched for what he called the illustrious vernacular, a refined and elevated form of Italian suitable for the highest intellectual work. This illustrious vernacular did not belong to any single Italian city or region. It was not Florentine or Neapolitan or Sicilian, though it drew from all of them. Dante compared it to a perfume that was present everywhere, but owned by no particular place. It was the best of what all Italian dialects could offer, distilled into a medium worthy of poetry and philosophy. This concept is essentially the theoretical blueprint for what would later become standard literary Italian. Dante did not just write in Italian, he invented the version of Italian in which serious writing could be done. The second front was practical, the Convivio, Dante's unfinished philosophical banquet. Dante wrote it in Italian deliberately, explaining his reasons in the first book with extraordinary care. Latin, he said, would not have served the commentaries on his poems because it would have reached only scholars. But the poems themselves were in Italian, and the audience that needed philosophical education was the Italian-speaking laity. Dante described himself as sitting at the feet of the great thinkers, collecting what fell from their table. His role was to redistribute those intellectual crumbs to people excluded from the Latin banquet by circumstance, not by capacity. This was not false modesty. It was a political act of knowledge redistribution. Dante believed that the desire for knowledge was a universal human trait, not a privilege of birth or education. The Convivio was planned as 15 books, but only 4 were completed before Dante abandoned it for the comedy. Even incomplete, it covered enormous intellectual ground: ethics, metaphysics, cosmology, and the nature of philosophy itself. In the 3rd book, Dante defined philosophy as the loving use of wisdom, drawing the term back to its Greek etymology. Philosophy was not a body of doctrines, but a practice of loving the truth in every domain of knowledge. This definition had consequences for who could be a philosopher. If philosophy is a practice of love rather than a credential of institutional training, then anyone with the right desire could pursue it. Dante did not say this explicitly, but the implication of writing philosophy in the vernacular was exactly this democratization. The Convivio opened a door that the medieval university had kept bolted shut. The 4th book of the Convivio contains Dante's most socially radical argument, his theory of nobility. He directly attacked the prevailing view that nobility was a matter of wealth, bloodline, and inherited status. Dante attributed this view to Emperor Frederick II and traced its intellectual roots to Aristotle's Politics. He then systematically dismantled it. Wealth, he argued, is treacherous and unstable. It cannot be the foundation of genuine human worth. Ancestry proves nothing, because virtuous parents can produce corrupt children and vice versa. True nobility is the seed of virtue implanted in the individual soul by God, regardless of social position. It manifests as moral excellence across the stages of human life, from youth through maturity to old age. This argument was politically explosive in feudal and guild-dominated Florence. It meant that a labourer could be more noble than a count if the labourer cultivated genuine virtue. It also meant that inherited privilege had no philosophical justification whatsoever. Dante did not follow this logic to its democratic conclusion. He was still a man of his time, with aristocratic instincts. But the argument itself was a seed that later humanists, reformers, and eventually democratic thinkers would cultivate. The principle that human worth derives from character rather than birth runs in a straight line from the Convivio through the Enlightenment. There is a deeper point about information systems embedded in Dante's language project. Every civilization is shaped by who has access to knowledge and in what form. When knowledge is locked in a specialist language accessible only to trained elites, power concentrates at the top. When knowledge circulates in languages that ordinary people speak, power becomes more distributed. The Protestant Reformation, which translated the Bible into vernacular languages, operated on the same principle 2 centuries later. The printing press, the public library, the open-access internet, all of these are extensions of the same logic. Dante did not cause these later developments. but he articulated their philosophical foundation before any of them existed. He understood that the language in which you think determines the thoughts you can have and share. Dante's decision to write the comedy itself in Italian rather than Latin was the ultimate enactment of this philosophy. He took the most complex, ambitious, intellectually dense work of his life and gave it to the people in their own tongue. This was not dumbing down. The comedy is more difficult than most Latin scholastic texts. It was a statement that depth and accessibility are not opposites, but can be achieved simultaneously. The result was that the comedy became the founding text of Italian literary culture. It standardized the Tuscan dialect as the basis for what would become the Italian national language. Petrarch, Boccaccio, and every subsequent Italian writer worked in the linguistic space Dante created. He did not just write a masterpiece. He built the language in which all future Italian masterpieces would be written. Part 11. The Limits of Knowing. Dante was a passionate advocate for human reason, but he was equally precise about where reason stops. His system is not a rationalist manifesto. It is a carefully mapped territory with clearly marked borders. Understanding where Dante drew those borders reveals something profound about his epistemology. That is, his theory of what humans can and cannot know, and why the boundary exists where it does. The basic framework is this. Human reason, working from sensory experience, can reach genuine truths about the natural world and moral life. Aristotle proved this. The pagan philosophers proved it. Virgil, who never knew Christ, proved it by living virtuously. Reason can demonstrate that God exists, that the soul is immortal, and that moral law has objective foundations. These are truths available to the natural intellect operating without any help from divine revelation. Dante honored this capacity fiercely. He placed pagan philosophers in limbo rather than in punishing hell, precisely because their use of reason was noble and correct. He placed Siger of Brabant in paradise, because Siger pushed reason to its absolute limits with intellectual honesty. Reason is not the enemy in Dante's system. It is the best tool humanity possesses for navigating the created world. But reason has a structural limitation that it cannot overcome by trying harder. Reason works by abstracting universal concepts from particular sensory experiences. You see, individual triangles and abstract the concept of triangularity. You see individual just acts and abstract the concept of justice. This process works brilliantly within the natural world because the natural world is made of particulars that embody universals. The problem arrives when you turn reason toward God, who is not a particular instance of anything. God is not one being among many beings. God is the source of being itself. The tools that work for understanding created things, abstraction from sensory data, cannot grasp the uncreated source. Reason approaches God asymptotically, getting closer without ever arriving. Dante dramatized this limit through the structural design of the comedy itself. Virgil, representing the highest achievement of human reason, guides Dante through hell and purgatory. But Virgil cannot enter paradise, because paradise exceeds the domain of natural knowledge. He hands Dante over to Beatrice, who represents revealed theology, knowledge given by God rather than discovered by human effort. This transition is not a demotion of reason, but a recognition of its boundaries. A ladder does not fail because it cannot reach the moon. It succeeds by reaching the rooftop, which is as far as a ladder can go. Virgil's departure at the top of purgatory is Dante's most poignant statement that reason deserves gratitude for everything it achieves. But pretending it achieves more than it does is its own form of intellectual sin. In the Paradiso, Dante encounters truths that exceed rational demonstration but do not contradict reason. The Trinity, the Incarnation, the resurrection of the body, these are revealed doctrines that reason cannot derive independently. But they do not violate logical consistency. They exceed the scope of what logic can prove. Dante followed Aquinas here in insisting that faith and reason occupy different jurisdictions, not opposing camps. A truth of faith cannot be proven by reason, but it also cannot be refuted by reason if it is genuinely from God. If an apparent conflict arises, either the reasoning is flawed or the interpretation of revelation is incorrect. This framework protected both the autonomy of philosophy and the authority of theology simultaneously. Neither could invade the other's territory without distorting itself. But Dante went beyond Aquinas in the final cantos of Paradiso, into territory that resembles negative theology. Negative theology is the tradition that says God can only be described by what God is not. God is not finite, not composite, not temporal, not material, not comprehensible by any positive description. Every affirmative statement about God falls short because God exceeds every category the human mind possesses. In the final canto, Dante describes his vision of God as 3 interpenetrating circles of light, but he immediately says that his language fails, that his memory of the vision is already fading even as he writes. His speech, he says, falls shorter of the truth than an infant's tongue still bathing at its mother's breast. The greatest poem in Western literature ends by declaring its own inadequacy to express what it has seen. This is not a rhetorical trick. It is an epistemological principle stated through narrative form. The highest truths are not reducible to propositions that the intellect can hold and examine at leisure. They are events that happen to the whole person, intellect, will and desire fused together in a single moment. The vision of God in Paradiso 33 is an experience, not an argument. Dante can describe the approach, the preparation, the emotional and intellectual conditions that made it possible. But the content of the vision itself slips through the net of language every time he tries to capture it. This aligns with a tradition running from Plotinus through Meister Eckhart to Wittgenstein's remark that what cannot be spoken of must be passed over in silence. Dante found a third option. Speak about the failure to speak, and let that failure communicate what direct speech cannot. There is a connection to modern consciousness studies that deserves careful statement. The so-called hard problem of consciousness asks why subjective experience exists at all. Why does it feel like something to be a particular person looking at a particular colour? Neuroscience can describe the mechanisms of perception, the neural correlates, the information processing. But it cannot explain why these mechanisms produce experience rather than just mechanical response. Dante confronted an analogous problem at the theological level. He could describe the approach to God, the intellectual conditions, the moral preparation required. But the actual encounter exceeded every descriptive framework, not because Dante was a bad writer, but because the object exceeded the capacity of any finite mind. Dante's treatment of this limit has practical implications that extend beyond theology. It suggests that any totalizing system, any framework that claims to explain everything, is making a category error. The universe is larger than any model of the universe, including the most sophisticated scientific models. This is not mysticism or anti-science. It is a statement about the relationship between maps and territories. The best map is still not the landscape. The best equation is still not the phenomenon it describes. Dante's comedy is itself the most ambitious map anyone had ever drawn of the complete structure of reality. And its final act is to show you the point where the map runs out of ink. That honesty, the willingness to build the most comprehensive possible system and then show you its edges, is perhaps Dante's most mature intellectual achievement. Part 12. Legacy, Misreadings, and the Living System. Dante has been read continuously for 700 years, but he has rarely been read whole. Every century selects the fragments that confirm its own preoccupations and ignores the rest. Correcting the most common misreadings is necessary before his actual legacy can be assessed. The first major misreading is that Dante was primarily a religious poet, expressing medieval Catholic orthodoxy. This reading dominated from the 14th century through the Counter-Reformation and persists in popular culture today. It is wrong for a specific reason. Dante placed multiple popes in hell and had the Church banned de monarchia for heresy. His theology was deeply personal, eclectic, and at key points openly defiant of papal authority. He placed the pagan Cato as guardian of purgatory and elevated Ziger of Brabant, a condemned philosopher, to paradise. He gave secular government an independent dignity that Orthodox Catholic doctrine explicitly denied. Calling Dante an Orthodox Catholic is like calling Galileo a conventional astronomer. He worked within the tradition, yes, but he bent it almost to breaking in several directions at once. The second misreading is the opposite, that Dante was a secular humanist avant la lettre who used religious language as mere allegory. This reading gained popularity during the Risorgimento, when Italian nationalists adopted Dante as a symbol of cultural unity. It fails because Dante genuinely believed in God, the immortality of the soul, and the reality of divine judgment. These were not decorative metaphors for psychological states. They were claims about the actual structure of reality. His theology was unorthodox in specific ways, but it was theology, not secularism dressed in religious costume. Reducing Dante to a humanist strips his system of the vertical dimension that holds it together. The third misreading is that the Inferno is the important part, and the rest is tedious piety. This reading reflects modern culture's appetite for spectacle and discomfort with sustained intellectual assent. In Dante's own structure, the Inferno is the foundation, not the building. Purgatorio contains his deepest psychology and his theory of human transformation. Paradiso contains his most advanced metaphysics, his epistemology, and his theory of cosmic love. Reading only the Inferno is like studying only pathology and never learning what a healthy body looks like. The comedy is one continuous argument, and the conclusion is in the last canto of Paradiso, not the last canto of Inferno. The person who reads only the Inferno has encountered Dante's diagnosis, but never his prescription. With those misreadings cleared, the actual influence can be traced. Dante's immediate successors, Petrarch and Boccaccio, built directly on his linguistic achievement. Petrarch refined the lyric poetry Dante had elevated. Boccaccio pioneered prose narrative in the vernacular Dante had legitimized. Together, these three writers created Italian literature as a living tradition rather than a provincial curiosity. But Dante's influence on political thought may be even more consequential than his literary impact. His argument for the separation of temporal and spiritual power travelled through the late medieval period into the Reformation. Machiavelli, writing 2 centuries later in Florence, assumed the separation of politics from religion that Dante had argued for. The line connecting De Monarchia to Machiavelli's Prince, to Hobbes's Leviathan, to the American Constitution is not direct, but it is real. In philosophy, Dante's influence was more diffuse, but no less important. His insistence that earthly happiness had genuine independent value helped create the intellectual space for Renaissance humanism. If human life on Earth matters in its own right, then studying human affairs, history, politics, art and nature is inherently worthwhile. This was the foundational assumption of the humanist movement, and Dante articulated it with full philosophical rigour decades before the Renaissance began. His theory of nobility as virtue rather than birth contributed to the slow erosion of feudal hierarchy across European thought. His democratization of knowledge through vernacular writing established a principle that every subsequent revolution in information access has extended. Dante's cosmology, while scientifically superseded, left a structural mark on the Western imagination. His vertical universe, ascending from degradation to perfection, from darkness to light, established a template for how Europeans visualized moral and spiritual reality for centuries. Milton's Paradise Lost is unthinkable without Dante's prior architecture. Milton adopted the cosmic scope, the moral mapping of space, and the integration of theology with narrative that Dante invented. In the 19th century, the Romantic poets, especially Shelley and Byron, rediscovered Dante as a figure of creative rebellion against institutional authority. The 20th century brought T.S. Eliot, who called Dante the most universal poet in the Western tradition and drew heavily on the comedy in The Waste Land and 4 quartets. Samuel Beckett, Jorge Luis Borges, and Osip Mandelstam each found different aspects of Dante essential to their own projects. The comedy is one of those rare works that each era reads differently because it contains more than any single era can absorb. In the sciences, Dante's direct influence is minimal, but certain structural resonances deserve mention. His 3-sphere cosmology anticipated the topology Einstein would use, as already discussed. His understanding of gravity as spherically symmetric attraction toward a centre predated Newton by centuries. His model of the mind as a layered processing system, moving from sensory input through estimation to intellectual abstraction. This maps onto the hierarchical processing models used in contemporary computational neuroscience. Modern neural networks process information in layers, from raw input through feature extraction to abstract classification. Dante described essentially the same functional architecture using medieval vocabulary instead of mathematical notation. These are not cases of Dante predicting modern science. They are cases of a brilliant mind, identifying real patterns in nature with the tools available to his century. The most serious critiques of Dante's system come from several directions. Protestant theology objected to purgatory as a concept with no scriptural basis and to the entire sacramental economy Dante assumed. If salvation is by faith alone, then the elaborate moral gymnastics of Dante's purgatory are unnecessary and misleading. Secular philosophy objects to the theistic framework itself, arguing that grounding ethics in divine will makes morality dependent on a being whose existence is unproven. Feminist criticism rightly notes that Dante's system assigns women only symbolic or intercessory roles. Beatrice is powerful, but only as a vehicle for divine truth, not as an independent intellectual agent with her own philosophy. Post-colonial criticism observes that Dante's universal claims assume a specifically European, Christian framework as the default for all humanity. His world government presupposes Christendom, and his cosmology maps European theological concerns onto the entire universe. These critiques are substantial and cannot be dismissed. Dante's system is limited by its historical moment in ways that reduce its applicability to a pluralistic, secular, global world. But three elements of his thought survive every critique and remain genuinely useful. First, his insistence that politics must serve human development, not merely maintain order, remains a powerful corrective to cynical realism. Second, his model of moral change through structured practice, community support, and the integration of emotion with reason anticipates the best of modern behavioral science. Third, his recognition that every system of knowledge has limits and that intellectual honesty requires mapping those limits explicitly is a permanent contribution to epistemology. The deepest legacy of Dante may be methodological rather than doctrinal. He demonstrated that it was possible to build a total vision of reality, integrating ethics, politics, psychology, cosmology, and theology into one coherent structure. Even if every specific claim he made were refuted, the ambition itself set a standard. It said that knowledge should not be fragmented into disconnected specialties that never speak to each other. It said that the question of how to live cannot be separated from the question of what the universe is. It said that the deepest truths are not found by narrowing your focus, but by widening it until everything connects. Modern academia has moved in the opposite direction, toward ever narrower specialization. Dante stands as a permanent reminder that the most important questions are the ones that cross every boundary. He died in Ravenna in September 1321, having never seen Florence again. The city that exiled him later demanded his bones back, and Ravenna refused. This is fitting, because Dante's work does not belong to Florence or Italy or Europe. It belongs to anyone willing to follow a mind that looked at the whole of reality and tried to understand it all at once. Not as a specialist, not as a partisan, but as a human being asking what it means to exist, to choose, to know, and to love. 700 years later, those questions have not changed. The answers he offered may be incomplete, but the seriousness with which he asked them remains unmatched.